Started here. So, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Almighty God, we ask you to teach us by your commandments how we should live. Help us to respect the gift of life, the property that we have, and also the integrity that we are called to in speaking the truth. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay. A little preview of the commandments we're going to talk about today. So, about life and property and truth. Also, before we get started, just a comment about the Easter Vigil, because I think some people had some questions. We were together at the cathedral for the rite of election, and that's at the cathedral. But the actual coming into the church will happen actually here. So that'll be at St. Thomas. So one of the things that you'll notice on the schedule or in the calendar, so if you look ahead, is the Wednesday before Easter, which this year is March 31st or April 1st, something like that. So that would be April 1st is a practice. That'll be the last Wednesday class that we have. And so that's a practice or rehearsal. We'll go through everything that's necessary to go through that night. And if you haven't made a confession, confessions will be heard that night. So any baptized people who need to confess can do so that night, if you haven't already been. And then the next item on the schedule is the Easter Vigil, which is April 4th, and that is actually a Saturday. So that's the Saturday right before Easter, and that's actually the day when people come into the church. So that will be here. That will be on Saturday, the Holy Saturday we call it, the day before Easter Sunday, and that will take place after nightfall. So, in fact, I didn't look this up yet. It has to be after nightfall, which means it has to be at least 8 o'clock, depending on when the sun sets. Sometimes 8:15 or something. So but it has to be dark out by the time we start the Easter Vigil. The Easter Vigil is a longer mass than normal, and so people say, "Was that long mass?" And it's because we do a little bit more than what we typically do at mass. We actually start outside with no lights in the church, no candles lit in the church. We actually start with the Easter fire, is what we call it. And so we gather just outside the church with the Easter fire. We bless the fire, and from that we light the new Easter candle. You might see the tall candle that's in the sanctuary, and right now you might say, well, it's a pretty tall candle. Well, that candle's like 10 months old, 11 months old. It used to be like that, okay? And so you'll actually be the new candle, so which is, I think it's like 4 feet tall when it's initially blessed. And so we'll bless the new candle, and people will light individual candles from the Easter candle. And it's a reminder of the Christ our light coming into the darkness. So after Christ's death and his time in the tomb, then with the resurrection, the light begins to dawn. And so you'll see the church become illuminated by candlelight, essentially. And from that, we'll also light other candles in the church. And then you'll see all the lights and the candles eventually be turned on and lit, just like you would normally see. After that first part of the liturgy of the light, or the liturgy of the candle, comes the liturgy of the word. So then we've got the readings. But we have a few extra readings. It's a little bit more extended than you're used to. So there are a couple Old Testament readings instead of just one. So again, a little bit more. Then we have the liturgy of baptism, and that's the part where people come into the church. So we normally you're used to just having 2 parts to the liturgy, the word and the Eucharist. And here we're going to now have 4 parts. We're going to add in the blessing of the candle. Then we'll do the liturgy of the word, which is kind of like what you're expecting. Then the liturgy of baptism, so the baptism and reception into the church of all the people coming in. And then the liturgy of the Eucharist. So 2 parts of that will seem very familiar. Liturgy of the Word will be familiar, Liturgy of the Eucharist will be familiar, but we add in those 2 other parts. And so it's in between, it's after the homily and before the preparation of the altar. We'll call forward those to be baptized. We'll have 1 to be baptized. We'll call forward those to be received into the church, so those who have already been baptized, they'll make their profession of faith. And then also those to be confirmed, including some who are already Catholic but not confirmed, and then we'll confirm them by the anointing with the holy oil, be sealed with the gift of the Holy Spirit. So there'll be baptism for some. There'll be reception into the church by profession of faith. We'll go through all this at the rehearsal, so it's not hard. And it's my job to remember what to do, so you don't have to worry about it. And then the confirmation of those. And then we'll prepare the gifts at the altar, and from there we'll consecrate the Eucharist for the first time. It'll be the tabernacle is empty when we start. So we consecrate new hosts beginning with the Easter Vigil. And then everyone who's been received into the church at communion time, you'll be the first ones to come forward because that will be your first communion. So there's several sacraments to receive, but that's going to be Saturday night, the night before Easter, and that will be here, not at the cathedral. Okay, so anyway, I think there was a little confusion about that, so I just wanted to emphasize that. Does that seem fine? Any questions about that part? So, okay, so more to come about that. So now the commandments, so we'll keep going. We talked about the first commandment, God is holy, so we should not have false gods. The second commandment, God's name is holy, so don't take the name in vain. Then the third, the Sabbath is holy, so remember the Lord's Day, or remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. Number 4, we talk about family being holy, so the blessings that come with family. So honor your father and your mother. And now we keep going with commandment number 5, because life is holy. So life is a gift from God, so therefore thou shalt not kill. Okay, so the 5th commandment, thou shalt not kill. If I was to then, for each commandment, I suppose I could phrase a positive, because I could say, here's the thing that is holy. Number 6, when we get to that, I would say, well, the body is holy. Or we can say that sexual union is holy. Therefore, 6th commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. Okay. And number 7, if your property is, so that which you have, that which is your possession is to be respected. Therefore, number 7, thou shalt not steal. And also the truth is holy. So God is truth. And so therefore, thou shalt not bear false witness. And another way to say that is thou shalt not lie. Okay. So in other words, there's always a positive. There's something each commandment is protecting while it's telling us not to do the sin that corresponds with violating that holy thing. So commandment number 5 is respect for life. Respect for life, therefore thou shalt not kill. We say that life is created by God, and the lifeblood that we have, the life which has been breathed into us, is sacred. And for each of our lives, we must render an account. So our lives become holy. So it is unjust to take life indiscriminately or unjustly. This goes all the way back in the scriptures. You remember the first time that this commandment was broken? The commandment wasn't issued until Moses came along. But the very first time when someone killed, you remember which one it was? Cain and Abel. So already, and they came right from, their parents were Adam and Eve. So right away, one generation in, Adam and Eve sin, and the very next thing, you turn the page to the next chapter, and Cain is jealous of his brother Abel and slays him. And so the taking of innocent life. God comes around and looks for Cain. He says, where is your brother Abel? And he says, and Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? Okay. And he said, no, I can hear the blood of Abel crying out from the ground. Because Abel's blood is holy. We also say that actually because Christ shed his blood, it's because Christ's blood, the righteous blood of Christ, also cries out. And that's also from which we receive redemption. So there's actually kind of a parallel there. But the blood of Christ is sacred. Of course, the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist is certainly sacred. But even our own blood is sacred because of the life that we have received. And it's a divine gift. And so we should use that well. After Noah, there is a command that was given. And so this shows up kind of early in Genesis in chapter 9. There's a wonderful phrase that says, if anyone sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. And so there's another reaffirmation of the idea of the sacredness of life. And then, of course, later from Moses and the 10 Commandments, we get, thou shalt not kill. You might also remember that Jesus interprets this commandment. He says, you have heard the commandment, thou shalt not kill. But what I say to you is, so Jesus strengthened it. Do you remember what Jesus said about that commandment? So obviously you should not kill. But I say, even moreover, thou shalt not become angry with your brother. So Jesus strengthens it. So he says, so we shall not have anger or hatred or vengeance, taking vengeance on your brother. So even that can become a kind of killing, not the literal taking of life, but what is it that would precede actual murder or homicide, but anger or hatred. And even that we should not allow to fester within our heart. So Jesus takes this and strengthens it a bit. And that's what we're going to do with this commandment. We're going to kind of talk about the other things that would fall under the 5th commandment beyond just simply, obviously that would include murder or homicide, as the Catechism says. So one of the things, however, to clarify, so does that mean that a person can never kill? Well, there's a principle that is present called self-defense, and you hear that sometimes in the legal circles, but it's also a moral principle as well. And so what's the concept behind self-defense? So the idea is that I can protect myself, and so my life is sacred, and so a person can defend himself from the unjust aggressor. So if someone's coming at you trying to take your life, can you fight back? The principle of self-defense says, yes, you can. The Catechism emphasizes that always needs to be in proportion or in moderation. So meaning that if you can defend yourself in some other way, short of taking the life of your attacker, then you're obliged to do so. So, if someone's coming at you to beat you up and you can run away or protect yourself, you're not within your rights to shoot that person, for example. So, or to use some worse means of retaliating. So, in other words, if you can neutralize the attacker without having to kill him, then proportion says that you do that out of respect for that person's life as well. They call this actually an example of the principle of double effect. And we haven't actually talked about this principle before in the moral section, but the principle of double effect says, okay, I'm performing an action and it's going to have two effects. So the person acts in self-defense. So what's the good effect that the person has done? What's the good that you're doing in defending yourself? You're saving your own life. What's the bad thing that you're doing by self-defense? You're taking the attacker's life, okay? And so anytime you have something that comes with a necessary double effect, one good and one bad, then the question of the principle of double effect comes in. You can never choose an act that has that double effect if out of a desire for the evil that is to be done. The idea is that I'm focused more on the good, and I'm going to tolerate the evil because it's necessary, but my principal responsibility is not to do the evil. Or if the evil is disproportionate. I just kind of talked about the disproportionate idea. But but for the sake of defending one's life, one can invoke that principle of self-defense. That should always be dealt with some moderation. So we're not trying to use that as an excuse to take life, because Jesus reminds us of a more fundamental principle of love for one's neighbor. We love our lives enough because we want to preserve it, but we should also love our neighbor and even our enemy. And so that's why we never seek to. The goal is not because we're seeking to take another life. It's because we're trying to save life that a person might use that self-defense. The idea of protecting the common good also means that you can use the same principle to intervene if you have an attacker who's coming after another person who may be helpless. So you're the third party. So is it legitimate to intervene to save another person's life by taking the life of the aggressor? Is that legitimate? What say you? You say yes. So does the Catechism. It says yes too. Okay, so you can use that principle of self-defense if you're being attacked to save yourself, but also if another person, especially a weaker person or an innocent person, we think about children or we think about someone who's helpless, it is legitimate to intervene to stop the aggressor there too. So it can be used also in that perspective as well, because we're trying to protect the common good. The common good says that life is valuable, and so we should intervene, especially to help the helpless. Okay, now I don't know how often any of us will find ourselves in this situation, unless you work in a hazardous situation. If you happen to be a police officer, you're going to run into this in all likelihood. But in a lot of positions, maybe we're fortunate enough never to have to worry about this, and that's a good thing. So when we talk about the aggressor or the person who's attacking, is it legitimate to punish them? The answer is yes. Okay, so should I keep quizzing you on this? I'm going to see if you know the Catechism. Yes, it's legitimate to punish, but what should punishment always be geared toward? Okay, it's not because we hate another person, because we love them, we should desire that the sinner be reformed. Okay, so punishment is to be geared toward the reform of the offender. That's a general principle. So then comes another thing this is a big point that came as a large point of discussion when Pope Francis was the Pope. The question of the death penalty. So is the death penalty legitimate? Okay, well, it kind of depends. Okay, that's right. So the concept behind the death penalty, so there you're not really giving the opportunity for reform, because instead you're now taking another person's life. Pope Francis was emphasizing that as long as we can keep society safe, in other words, if there's another means of keeping people safe, then it would be better to not inflict the death penalty so long as society can be protected. The idea behind the death penalty is really more one that was much more necessary, and I can even say necessary, probably more so in times past, because you could have people who were just so dangerous that they would pose a risk, maybe you couldn't always protect society, and there's that danger that so-and-so is gonna escape or whatnot, or, and if you're in a very kind of a lawless country, you might say, well, the kingpin or the cartel leader or whatever is, well, their gang is going to rescue him, and then he's going to be back out taking lives again. So sometimes if you cannot protect the innocent society and hear the good that's there, because what's the primary purpose? To save life. So if a person would have to use the death penalty in order to save life, that would be the only reason in which you could really justify to say, yes, this is actually morally acceptable or maybe even morally necessary. Because there's too much of a danger that person poses to society. But on the other hand, if we're able to adequately protect society, and people can have their opinions about jails and incarceration and all that in the current penal system, but as long as you can protect society, Pope Francis's point was to emphasize that we shouldn't have to resort to the death penalty if there's another way to protect society. So the goal isn't to try to inflict harm. The goal is to try to save life. So anyway. So I belabored that point too much, but that was a big debate in terms of self-defense and I could get into maybe some other cases. There have been some court cases about people using self-defense as a legal point. I won't get into any specific cases, but you might imagine some, and not that distant past. So in our legal system, and the point is, and the issues that were there were debated are precisely the ones that I'm talking about today, in a moral sense at least. So other things about the fifth commandment. So what's forbidden by the fifth commandment? So homicide. So homicide is the killing of a human being. So that would obviously be part of that. Also was So infanticide would be the killing of an infant, and that's maybe less present today. In ancient times, that was much more common. But certainly infanticide is wrong, because in particular, children possess a kind of innocence, and I think we're sort of naturally moved toward protecting them. So infanticide is particularly heinous. Then there's fratricide, the killing of one's brother. Okay. There's patricide, the killing of one's father, or matricide is when you kill your mattress. No, that's right. Matricide, technically the killing of one's mother. Conjugicide, you ever heard of that one before? This is a real word, conjugicide, from conjugus, which is spouse, the killing of one's spouse. So sometimes this is actually part of the plot of Sister Act, if you ever remember. So is that because the mobster is Catholic and he can't get an annulment, so I'll just kill her, and then I'll be free to marry. However, if one kills one's spouse, that is an impediment to getting married. You are prohibited from marriage, so you cannot use the killing of one's spouse as a means of entering another marriage. So I bet you didn't know that. Well, now you know that. Okay, that's okay. So anyway. There's your canon law trivia for the day. So the killing of any human life. Now, what about the indirect killing? This can be morally culpable. You may be culpable for the indirect killing, meaning I didn't mean to do that, but if you were negligent, and they would refer to that as negligent homicide. We need a lawyer to give us an attorney to give us the technical legal terms. But so the idea of negligence. So you could be held responsible because you should have taken care, and because you were careless, someone else was exposed to risk. So you can be held responsible for the indirect killing insofar as you were negligent in your actions. Well, I didn't mean to do it. Well, but how did you behave? What did you do? Now, the unintentional killing, so the taking of life, and it's completely unintentional. So something that's accidental, you're not at fault, there was no negligence involved. Now, that still may be punished in the civil sphere, I won't speak to that. But morally, morally there is no sin in the accidental. Something's just an accident. It was, so things sometimes happen. So this can, I hesitate to kind of give examples, but someone in providing medical care, sometimes someone gets misdiagnosed or something. I'm like, well, if you had known this, you might have been able to help, but you just didn't. But it wasn't, there was no intention, there was no malice, there was no negligence. Unintentional killing is not morally imputable to the person. We would say that that's not a sin. But direct intentional killing, unintentional killing through negligence, or indirect killing through negligence, but not the unintentional one in which there is no fault. Obviously, abortion would be another serious case. Abortion carries with it an excommunication. People may not know that, but so the taking of life in the womb, we still say, so that's so from conception until natural death. And so taking of human life through abortion is a very serious matter, and the church carries particular concern for the life of the unborn, as also it takes into concern the idea of the elderly. So the elderly should not just simply be done away with. What do they call that term for the elderly when the elderly are killed? They say euthanasia is the technical term, or sometimes you will hear the idea of assisted suicide, or you'll hear things like that. So you'll hear those terms. So both of those are moral. So from whether it's the very young or the very old, sometimes there's that tendency to say that the very young, or especially embryos, don't matter because they're not valuable. We assign them less value. That's not true. So, but sometimes we think of that, and he said, or the elderly. Well, they can't help themselves any longer. It's just, but the idea is there's human dignity throughout, even, for the dying, even for the elderly. So we want to respect from conception until natural death. Natural death does not mean that you have to preserve life at all costs. It is perfectly fine to decline treatment for various maladies toward the end of life, because you say, well, there's no, I don't want to go through this extra surgery or take these extra steps. It's okay to accept death. In other words, death is a natural thing that will affect all of us in the end. So accepting death is perfectly fine. Trying to precipitate death, or to cause the death, or to cause death to happen prematurely would be sinful. Accepting death is perfectly natural. Does that make sense? Did I make that distinction? Okay. So one of the other things about respecting embryos, for example, this also gets into the idea of in vitro fertilization. And I think sometimes when people think about that, they say, oh, well, that should be perfectly wonderful, because look, here children are coming into the world. But one of the things that I think people don't always think through about in vitro fertilization, so it is kind of playing around with human life. And so you're talking about conceiving the embryo and then implanting it. And oftentimes what will happen is medical personnel will conceive, they will cultivate several embryos and sort of just try to implant, several, and hope one sticks. Well, what does that say about the ones that don't? It's a little bit callous toward life. And the other thing that can sometimes happen, and I've talked with people in this situation too, is that sometimes they say, okay, well, it's such an expensive thing, so they sort of have several embryos and then they get placed into they're cryogenically frozen. And then the thing is, and then they implant one and you start having children. And then let's say that you now are kind of at the point, well, I don't know that I can have any more children, but there are a couple embryos sitting over there. Now, what do you do with that? And they don't think about that sometimes. And they realize, well, I'm old enough, I'm too old or not healthy enough to go through that another time. And yet I still have an embryo and I don't know what to do. And now what's left for that child? I mean, it's one that's filled with a lot of moral issues that I think sometimes people don't think of. That's the reason why the church does not approve of the use of in vitro fertilization. Also, treating an embryo in the womb. So anything that will help preserve or enhance life, But sometimes people might do testing and then they say, well, there's a disposition for some disease, and well, maybe it's just better if we just end this now. So there are some dangers in some of that prenatal care if it leads to a lack of respect for the human life that is present. So that's another issue that's brought up a little bit in the catechism. So okay. Anyway, there's more detail in the catechism about some specific circumstances. What about things that are not literally the taking of life, but the lack of respect for human dignity? So just like we said, anger, remember, it's not just killing, but becoming angry, Jesus says, also is a violation of the fifth commandment. So other things like causing scandal, leading another person into sin, that can also do spiritual harm to a person. So it doesn't have to just simply be the taking of life from the body, but causing scandal. Not taking care of one's own health. So let's say a person knows that I should be doing this or that. And so a person can be effectually killing themselves. Okay. Now I'm not saying this is the same as committing murder, but it can also be an unjust thing. So we should respect our own lives to take care of ourselves. So a person who, and I'm not saying that, just anyone who, for example, drinks alcohol or smokes or something like that is automatically guilty of the fifth commandment. But if a person was, for example, to abuse things in excess and so as to really damage their health, that's not a good thing. And it falls kind of under the scope of the fifth commandment. So people who are abusing, say, for example, drugs or things like that, this could be an example of a lack of respect for one's own body or one's own life. Respecting the body also means, the Catechism talks a little bit about scientific research, and donating one's body to science can be a noble thing. And sometimes there will be experiments that will be done. It's always important in medical experimentation, they're trying out a new drug or trying out some new thing, always to respect the lives of those who are participating in that study, for example. So human life should be respected throughout. So there's some things where you can say, well, science needs, this to advance this or that. But it is considered immoral in doing drug testing or whatnot. If you discover that you reach a point at which you realize that there's harm being done to certain people, he says, well, no, then you have to morally discontinue certain tests if it's actually harming people, or you can tell that it's bringing about a negative effect or harmful effect. So there has to be a kind of careful, there's a lot in medical ethics where you have to really be careful about the fine line between what you're doing to try to advance science, but always with respect for the human person. The bottom line is that we must respect the body, and human life, and treat it with the dignity that it deserves as part of God's creation. Other things that can violate bodily integrity, so this would include, say, kidnapping. Okay, that would be an offense against someone's person. So that falls under the fifth commandment. Terrorism, mutilation of a person, that's under the fifth commandment. Even sterilization. So the forced sterilization of someone is, so the body has a certain integrity, and so to deliberately disrupt something within the body would be considered immoral. So even sterilization would fall under the fifth commandment. Also with respect to the dead, even the dead body deserves respect. And so we always want to be respectful of the dead, and that includes by providing a proper burial. So to bury the dead is a corporal work of mercy, and in fact, something that we are called to do out of respect for the life that was present in that body. So we don't just simply discard the dead or treat them even as if it's unimportant. Sometimes when cremation occurs, then you say, well, now you just have ashes. But the church teaches us, even with the cremated remains, to treat them also still with respect. So even though the body has been cremated, we still say that it is proper to bury or inter in a final resting place, to provide a final resting place for cremated remains, just as we would provide for the body. So that's an important thing. We talked about, Jesus says that to become angry with one's brother violates the fifth commandment. So we should also safeguard peace. So anything that works against peace. So whether it's anger, hatred, revenge, the hatred for another person because of their color, their race, or things like that, this would all be a violation of the fifth commandment. True peace is what we should strive for. And that's more than just simply the absence of conflict. No, we want to try to work for true peace, which means to live truly in harmony with one another. It's a challenge, but it's an important thing to do. It also means that we should avoid war. So war is something that we should not look upon as desirable, or like, oh, thank God we're going to war. Or so. And you hear that, especially nowadays we're dealing with conflicts between nations and in the Middle East, and so there's issues of war that are present. So can war ever be justified? What do you think? Can war be justified? Is there a just war? Okay, there is a theory called the just war theory. So what is it that can make a war just? It's actually very much like the principle of self-defense. So if you talk about protecting a single person, and you're now going to attack the aggressor, so the aggressor is coming at the defenseless person, you can fight off the attacker. That's legitimate because we call that the principle of self-defense. It's still actually, in writ large, it's actually the same principle. And so the idea is that if you have someone who is an aggressor, and you have then people who are in the path of that aggressor, or they're in danger from another nation that is now marching or coming, you can come to the defense of a nation in order to protect those citizens. If you're fighting against an aggressor in war, some of the important principles is that war should always be the last resort. We always want to try for some other solution short of war if necessary. And any act of war should always be very careful to respect the innocent civilian population. So these would be some of the things that would constitute a just war. But for example, it's probably the best, where it's really, really clear, is once we kind of figured out in World War II what Hitler was up to, of course the right thing was to go fight against Hitler. So because that was just so eminently unjust, although it might not have been as clear early on just what was happening. But certainly in retrospect, we realized just how evil that was, and the right thing to do was to go to war in order to defend people who were otherwise being sent to concentration camps, or other people that were being conquered or slaughtered in parts of Europe during that war. So there is such a thing as, in fact, a just reason to come to war. But again, why? Because you love life and you're defending life. So it's for the defense of life that we can actually tolerate a war and want to prosecute in a way that's still consistent with the principle of valuing human life. Okay, so there's your fifth commandment. Okay, touched a lot of things, right? Okay, medical ethics, war, suicide, all those types of things. So there's a lot that's packed into the fifth commandment. So that's a quick overview of what the catechism contains. You can read the parts of the catechism if you want to go into any further detail, since I just kind of skimmed over parts of that. So commandment number 7, that's the one, thou shalt not steal. So there we talk about the sacredness of, or the holiness of property, that there should be respect for what you own, so that which belongs to you. Just like all the private property that existed in the Garden of Eden, right? Didn't Adam and Eve have private property? Because if they ever got divorced, then they'd have to determine whose property was whose and stuff like that. No. In the Garden of Eden, there was no private property. It's interesting that when everything was created, so what did God say? He says, I give you all of this for your benefit. So eat of any of the fruit of any of the trees except the ones in the center of the garden. But they didn't have to work for anything. It just simply was given to them by God. And so you might say that the way that creation was initially designed is that everything just belonged to everyone. There was no private property. Then sin entered the world, and with sin comes private property. That's okay. Now I sound like a communist when I say that. Okay. Sheen talked about communism really being against private ownership of goods. So Fulton Sheen would talk about that. Well, the truth is, though, that in our world today, however, we have to labor, and then we labor, and then the fruits of our labor, through that we actually provide the bread we eat and so forth. And so there is a sense that a person has exercised ownership over certain things, and it is right that be protected and safeguarded. However, in the end, will you take any of your private property with you to heaven? No. Okay. So do you take it? There is the old joke that says that they saw the hearse driving by, and the person looks and he says, "Boy, I wonder how much he left," and the other person says, "He left it all." But we leave it all in the end. And that means that in the end, we actually go back to the original state that creation was made in. Because in heaven, then everything belongs to everyone. So you have no need. So you have no need to protect your private property in heaven. So that's why The evangelical counsel, we talked about the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The evangelical counsel of poverty, meaning I'm going to live without accumulating worldly goods, is a foretaste of the kingdom. It's an anticipation of the way that we will live. We'll all live that way in the kingdom of heaven. So it's an interesting little preamble in the catechism to the seventh commandment, because it helps us put a few things in perspective. So yes, it's wrong to steal. Yes, you can have private property. And yes, your private property should be respected and protected. But it's not an absolute right, meaning like I can just accumulate and accumulate and accumulate, because we also have a responsibility to other people as well. So it's not necessarily just for one person to accumulate everything and nobody has anything else. If you end up with that type of a disproportion, then now we have another kind of injustice, because now other people are deprived. And we do have a duty to one another. Now this is not socialism. I'm not just endorsing that as is, but nor is unfettered capitalism just as well. So socialism or communism in which there is no private property is actually not respectful of a person's labor. So a person has a right to the fruits of their labor. But unfettered capitalism, meaning the acquisition of goods or of money, no matter what effect it might have on other people, that can also be unjust. So there's a kind of a balance between the two, in which we always have to uphold the dignity of the human person, even over the ownership of the things that we have, even over our property. So this is one of the things that is mentioned in the Catechism, and it walks a fine line here between this. So it is legitimate for political authorities, for example, to regulate the ownership of goods. And so there are laws that determine, the idea of how you determine possession of things, and things like taxation for the purpose. So yes, the government, what's taxation? The government is taking from you, but there is a legitimate reason for the government to tax in order to support the common good and to provide for what is necessary in a society. We also should practice the virtue of temperance. Temperance is that virtue that says we need to moderate our desires. So we shouldn't just give unfettered rein to whatever it is we want. So have as much as you want and accumulate as much as you want. And I put everything into my barns, and my barns weren't big enough, so I know what I'll do. I'll tear them down and I'll dig up bigger barns, so that way I have everything that I need. And I'll sit back and I'll say, take life easy, because you have plenty of good things stored up in reserve. And what did the Lord say to that person? You fool, this very night your life will be required of you, and where will all these things go? So Jesus even has a kind of a warning against accumulating in an unfettered way, just possessions for no other reason. What did the rich young man run into? He had many possessions. So when Jesus said, follow me, sell what you have, give to the poor, and come follow me. And he couldn't do it because he had many possessions. So his possessions actually weighed him down. So we have to sometimes be a little careful, because sometimes building up too much or acquiring too much, if it captures our hearts, riches can captivate the heart, and it can hold us back from spiritual things. What's the root of all evil? It's money, right? Money is the root of all evil. No, it's the love of money is the root of all evil. So money itself is neutral. Money is neither good nor bad. It's a means of essentially of acquiring someone's labor or their productivity, and in exchange for goods or services. So money is just a means of exchange. But the love of money is something that can actually poison the heart. So we must be careful about that. So what are the things that we should avoid doing? Stealing, taking another person's possessions. That would be wrong. So theft is wrong. But so would be retaining something unjustly. So you borrow the weed eater from your neighbor, and you're done using it, but you don't give it back. Well, that's a sin. Okay, you just sinned. Okay, so return what you have borrowed in a timely way. To break one's promises is another way of stealing. You're stealing from someone. I promised I would do that, and now I'm stealing from you because I did that. Breaking a contract. Now, contracts themselves have what they sometimes call commutative justice. So, if someone is not fulfilling their thing, you say, well, you're not doing your end of the contract, so I'm now going to break my end of the contract. But in general, if you have made an agreement or signed a contract with someone, you should honor that. To break that needlessly would be to steal. So that would be under the seventh commandment. To do so without a reason. We also have a duty to repair injustices. So Zacchaeus, for example, if I ever tax someone, if I ever am unjust, I repay the person fourfold. The Zacchaeus said, if you remember that story from the scriptures. So if we have stolen something, we do have a responsibility to repay. Gambling, is gambling okay? Are you stealing when you gamble? If you win too much, is that like stealing from the house? No. But gambling could be wrong. It could be a form of stealing. What about the person who takes all his money and isn't providing for his family because he's constantly gambling? So the gambling addict who's gambling away what his family depends on for their support, he's stealing from his family. He owes his family. So gambling, excessive gambling can be a kind of stealing. So we have to be a little careful about that. But gambling is not automatically wrong, but excessive gambling, especially beyond one's means, that can be a kind of stealing. Enslavement of another person, you're stealing their freedom. That can be the same type of thing. If a person is abusing creation, so we talk about respect for creation. So if a person is taking or destroying the goods in the world or resources in the world for no purpose, then in some senses you could say you're stealing from other people who would have a right to those same things. So this is one of those reasons why sometimes when they talk about, like, there's a distinction between hunting. Hunting can be something that can be useful in controlling animal population or in feeding yourself or your family. Poaching, which would be another type of thing. Sometimes you have rare animals where they will poach different animals and that would be illegal. Now you're just simply taking animal life, but for no good reason. So that always has to be kind of taken from the point of view of a certain respect for creation, and also a certain respect for animals. We don't cause suffering to animals needlessly. And that's part of where someone who knows what they're doing as a hunter knows really the right way to hunt, because you're not trying to maximize pain or discomfort even for an animal. That's all sort of mentioned under the seventh commandment in the Catechism. Social doctrines of the church say that we always value people over money, so people over things. And so even the temporal aspects of the common good, meaning how we use the things of the world, we need to subjugate that to the sovereign good, or to the eternal values that are there. So remember, the things that we have in the world, they all pass away. So we don't make a God out of possessions. That's a kind of idolatry, actually, if we put things as our supreme good, because in the end, everything that we have, we should recognize that all of it comes to us as a gift, and we should also be generous with those around us. So the social doctrines of the church, they really began to be defined in the late 1800s. There's a teaching, it's like a document called Rerum Novarum, that talks about the social teachings of the church, and would talk about things like stealing from an employer, stealing from employees by, for example, not paying a fair wage. So an employer who's just profiting off of his employees without care for his employees or respect for his employees, that would be unjust. It's stealing from them. The employee who doesn't put in an honest day's work is stealing from his employer. So because the person's being paid, but if they're being paid and they're not doing the work, that's unjust. So we actually have a kind of a mutual relationship with one another. And when employer and employee respect one another, then you actually have a healthy environment. And that's what should be there, is there's a sense of profound respect. But to abuse the other is not right. Human work has dignity. And so a person should have the right to take economic initiative in order to improve themselves. At the same time, it is legitimate for the government to regulate economic activity for the sake of protecting the common good. So it's a tension that we're trying to protect there. People should enjoy the fruit of their labor, have the right to enjoy the fruit of their labor, the right to work or to find employment. They deserve a just wage, which is dependent upon the circumstances within society. The Catechism talks about the right that workers have to strike to protest against unjust conditions, and also to be provided for their social security. By that, I don't mean Social Security as we understand, but just the idea of like my future security. So a person should in fact be provided for, and so they should be able to secure their future even in their years when they are no longer able to work. Another part of stealing has to do with nations and the way that, so it's not just the rich person and the poor person, but what about the rich nation and the poor nation? There's a kind of solidarity that should be present and a certain sense of obligation to look after and care for those that are more economically depressed. When there's a natural disaster, what oftentimes happens? Then suddenly different countries around the world will come to the aid of a country that has suffered a natural disaster, and that is a noble thing, because we do owe it to another. If you have a neighbor who's in distress, and you realize they just lost their home, and so what happens is people oftentimes will come forward and they'll, oh, here, let me bring you some clothing, let me help you find a place to stay, let me help you stay warm, just as we would take care of a neighbor, and that would be the proper thing to do, to look after someone in their need. So also on the level of nations, we should do the same type of thing. So there is something noble about that. The seventh commandment also emphasizes in our care for people over things, that means that we should have a love for the poor. And Jesus commends this oftentimes, talking about the poor and so the way in which we give alms and look after those that are less fortunate. So to care for the poor is to provide for them, and Jesus encourages that from the corporal works of mercy. So yes, we should feed the hungry and give drink to the thirsty and clothe the naked and shelter the homeless and visit the imprisoned and care for the sick, and then also bury the dead. But also the spiritual works of mercy. So I just said the corporal works of mercy, but the spiritual works of mercy, so to instruct the ignorant, to advise the doubtful, or to advise or admonish the sinner, to console the doubtful, to comfort the afflicted, to forgive the sinner, to bear wrongs patiently, and to pray for the dead. Those are important too. They're all acts of charity, and we do this because we see the need in the poor that is in our midst, and the Lord hears the cry of the poor, and God has love for the poor, and so should we. And there's your seventh commandment. Okay, so it kind of puts things in perspective, actually, that last point, which is good. The eighth commandment, do I have enough time? Sure, we can get through that. So God is truth, so thou shalt not bear false witness. So the idea of telling a lie or bearing false witness, it's a violation of God who is truth. And Jesus says that the truth shall set you free. Okay. So Jesus has come to speak the truth to us. We have a natural tendency toward the truth. We desire to trust people and to believe that they are truthful. And so we do have an obligation to truthfulness, which really is for the good of society. Imagine if you had a society in which no one was required to be truthful. You couldn't trust anyone. So society would break down if you don't have a respect for the truth. So the truth means that a person says what they mean, or that they mean what they say, that if they say that they'll do something, that they will do that. If they're saying that something is, then we can trust that that is a true statement. To hedge on that is really to imperil our relationships. If you have someone who in your life who you know is a chronic liar, that will not be someone that you will develop a good friendship with, because you'll realize very quickly that you can't trust that person, and that will become very evident quickly. So we have a responsibility to bear witness to the truth. So this not only means being truthful, but to witness to the truth. And so sometimes that means announcing the gospel, proclaiming the gospel. So we say, this is true, so God is love, or that, God asks us to live a virtuous life. If we were to tell someone that he says, well, no, it's okay if you sin, then we're not witnessing to the truth. So one of the kindest things to do, this is charity, is to tell the truth to another person. And so sometimes that means sometimes saying things that are maybe unpleasant, or saying things that are hard. So if you're, depending on the circumstances and your relationship with that person, to say that something isn't right, and maybe they don't want to hear it, but sometimes telling the truth about the gospel, or telling the truth about our moral obligations, is actually kind. Now, that discussion might not go so well, and so it might not think that you're kind, but that actually is one of the responsibilities that we have in bearing witness to the truth, is to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, not the gospel of the world. The gospel of the world, it wants to tell you whatever you want to hear, but the gospel of Jesus Christ tells you what you need to hear, and it's better to tell people what they need to hear. The greatest act of witness is actually performed by the martyrs. The word martyr itself, it comes martyr, and literally the word martyr, martyrs, in Greek means witness. So a martyr is a witness. And they give the supreme witness because they say, this is so important. This truth, what I profess and what I believe is so important, it's worth my life. That's what a martyr is saying. And so that is actually the greatest witness to the truth that you can have, is a martyr who professes the faith, even in the face of certain death. So what are some of the things to be concerned about? So lying, telling lies, okay, that's a violation of the 8th commandment. To give false witness, so to testify to something that's untrue. To commit perjury, perjury would be telling an untruth under oath, which not only would be the 7th commandment or the 8th commandment, but it also would be which other commandment? Perjury. So in the name of the Lord, I swear under oath that this is untrue. I am taking the Lord's name in vain. It's the 2nd commandment. 2nd commandment says don't swear a false oath. So perjury actually came up when we talked about commandment number 2, don't take the name of the Lord in vain. And it comes up under commandment number 8, don't bear false witness. To respect a person's reputation means that we don't spread gossip. That would be another type of false witness. To come to rash judgment, so I'm going to just presume the worst of someone, is false witness. That's the 8th commandment. Detraction. Detraction is when you speculate about another person's fault. So whether you know that it's true or not, you spread malicious things about another person. Or calumny. The detraction is you don't know, but you're going to tell bad things about people. Calumny is you may be telling something that is true, but you're harming the person's reputation. So let me tell you about this guy. Let me tell you about his past or her past. So it might be true, but just because it's true doesn't mean that it's right to tell that story or to spread that around. So even saying something that might be true, but that is harming another person's reputation needlessly, can be calumny. So we should be careful about protecting other people's reputation. We should treat our neighbor in the most favorable way that we can. So sometimes maybe we know that someone is taking advantage of us. It doesn't mean that we have to be naive, but we should be at least, we should hope for the best or presume the best about people in a general sense. If we've harmed someone's reputation, we should repair that harm. So it's important to undo as much as we can any harm that we've caused by gossip or spreading rumors about someone. Even flattery can be bearing false witness. If I'm saying something that's untrue, I'm going to tell you what I think you want to hear because I want you to be my friend. Well, that's flattery. So that can be the same type of thing. Boasting about oneself. Let me tell you what I've done, but it's not true. Well, that boasting actually can be a sin. Lies themselves, you can have more or less serious lies. So some lies could be really serious. If you lie about something really important, if you tell a lie that causes another person, for example, to be arrested or imprisoned falsely, that lie can cause serious harm. That could be a very grave sin. Does this dress make me look fat? No, honey, it doesn't. Okay, some lies might be minor. Okay, so this is okay. So you get a whole range of lies. It's possible for lies to be quite serious if they do great. The question is, how much harm have you done with the lie? Some lies you can say, well, it's a lie, but some will be very, very minor. So lies, you have to kind of realize there's a scale in terms of the substance of that. We have, when it comes to the truth, we have the right to communicate with one another, and the right we can request and ask information, but we don't always have the right to answers. So we can communicate and we can ask questions, but sometimes we have to be respectful of the fact that we may not deserve an answer to a question that we might have. So, excuse me, there are times when we have to protect secrecy, and that occurs when people go to confession. So let's say a person comes to confession, and then they come to me and they say, well, what did that person confess? Well, I have to tell the truth, don't I? Don't I have to say and truthfully say what they did? No, because they don't have a right to that answer. And I don't have a right to divulge that. So there are some times in which you can't answer a question because that answer is not deserved, or it's not really right or just to give that answer. That happens professionally. So sometimes counselors or doctors or lawyers have to respect the professional confidentiality that's required of their profession. And so sometimes the answer is I cannot tell you. Or it's not right to answer that question. So we can always ask, but we don't necessarily deserve to know certain answers. And we should always respect, even if it's just simple respect for privacy. So someone could ask a question you might know, but there's no good that can come from answering the question. So it's perfectly fine to say, no, I'm not going to answer that question. So that's perfectly fine to do. When we use social communication, we do strive for certain things when we communicate with one another, and that could be online, that could be in newspapers, that could be in books, that could be in speeches. We value the truth. We also value freedom of expression. We value justice, so we should always work for justice, and solidarity, that we should work in harmony. Now, this is not always present. For example, on Twitter, okay? So sometimes we actually find that in various communications, sometimes the truth is not present, and that's not a good thing. So harm can come from that. Sometimes we can say that freedom is restricted, so there's the idea of freedom of expression. When that's restricted, that can be very harmful, so that's not always good. Sometimes a person can use means of communication to commit injustice. So perhaps they're doing harm to another person. They say, well, that's not just, that's not good. Or also if it lacks solidarity, if it's just there to try to rouse people up or anger them or foment distress, or just hurt another person's reputation. We have to be careful about how we use some of these instruments of communication. So we try to protect all those things that I mentioned, of freedom, truth, justice, and solidarity. There is a particular duty that is imposed upon certain people in the society to be truthful in their use of communication. And who are the people who are especially urged to be truthful in communication? Any guesses? Journalists. Okay, that's what. Okay, journalists have a special duty to tell the truth. Does that happen all the time? Okay, that's okay. But those who are reporting, those reporters or journalists, have an obligation or responsibility to seek out and then to report the truth. It doesn't always happen. And who else has a duty to the truth in the service of the public good? Those who are public servants. Politicians have a duty to tell the truth. How about that? So that's actually one of my favorite parts of the Catechism, when it explains the particular duty of reporters and politicians to tell the truth. So that's there we have, and then this section of the Catechism ends with a little bit on art, because art should work toward true and the beautiful. And so a good artist is going to even use art to reflect the truth. So the truth can even be found in sacred art. So when you depict things well, or you depict things that are true, art should be a reflection of the goodness of God and his divinity, or the nobility of humanity. So there can sometimes be bad art which does harm to either God or man. But the most noble art that's there, and in particular sacred art, the type you would find especially in churches, should be things that lift up the soul and teach us the truths about God and truths about humanity. And that's what makes for good art, because it corresponds to the truth. It's beautiful and it corresponds to the truth. Okay, so there's Commandment 8. So we got through with just a little over. And the next time we'll finish off the last three commandments, Commandments 6, 9, and 10. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.